going to talk about ecosystem diversity. Ecosystem diversity are the range of different habitats or the number of different ecological niches per area in an ecosystem. I generally think of the number of niches in an ecosystem, but both definitions are correct. Basically, the more niches that you have, the more species diversity that you're going to have. The more species diversity that you have, generally the more genetic diversity you're going to have. And now you're going to have ecosystems that are better able to respond to disturbance and stress. And you want healthy ecosystems that are able to respond to disturbance or stress so that when you have disturbances, you don't have collapses of entire communities and entire ecosystems. So basically, you want to have these ecosystems. You want to have a lot of different ecosystems, and you want to have a wide variety of niches within your ecosystems to support healthy communities. The healthier the ecosystem and the more ecosystem diversity that you have, the more resilient your ecosystem is going to be. So all ecosystems are constantly changing. No ecosystem is constant. As humans, we like to think that what the Everglades looked like when we first came to America is what the Everglades should look like now. But all ecosystems are constantly changing because they're all encountering different amounts of stress. So everything is constantly changing. And but even though they're changing, all ecosystems have some sort of ability to respond, to withstand that stress, to respond to that disturbance and not be impacted and not be changed. So all ecosystems are changing. However, they're able to withstand certain amount of stress to not get pushed one way or the other and change too drastically so that you end up with collapse of all the organisms that live there. It's important for succession to be able to restore ecosystems, even if not exactly to how they were before, but in terms of biomass and species richness and productivity. You don't want to have disturbance occur, have succession occur, and then have an ecosystem that's less productive with less species richness and less biomass. That's not going to be a healthy response. You want them to respond in a way that restores them to their previous health. And all of that is dependent on their current health. The issue is that all these ecosystems are able to handle a certain amount of stress, but the addition of human activity and the addition of those stresses is impacting their ability to handle the normal amount of stress that they're adapted to survive. So in areas with high levels of fire, those ecosystems are adapted to respond to high levels of fire, but they're not necessarily adapted to respond to high levels of fire plus the added stresses of having humans impact those ecosystems with the addition of pollutants, with the addition of nutrients, and maybe the addition of, I was thinking of like not having fires. So they have to be healthy enough so they can respond, but they're never going to be healthy enough to respond to their normal stresses plus all the additional human stresses. So a healthier ecosystem is more resilient. How do we measure what it means to be a healthy ecosystem? I've said it a couple different times. Oh, it has to be a healthy ecosystem. But what do I mean? How am I measuring health? So I'm measuring health in two ways. One is inertia and the other is resilience. Inertia, another way people say persistence, is the ability of an ecosystem to survive a moderate disturbance. So when it is disturbed, not too intensely, is it able to bounce back to where it was before? And that is inertia. And I know I've been saying like ecological succession doesn't return the ecosystem to where it was before after a certain extent. So not all disturbances lead to secondary succession or primary succession. Some aren't intense enough to completely start from scratch. Those types of disturbances, can the ecosystem return to where it was before? That's inertia. Resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to be restored through ecological succession after a severe disturbance. So now you're pushing it even farther back. You're clearing that land. You're clearing the vegetation down to the soil, and can the ecosystem return in terms of biomass, in terms of productivity, in terms of number of ecological niches, in terms of its ecosystem diversity, in terms of its species diversity, in terms of its number of species and species evenness. So those two things are a little bit different. Inertia versus resilience, both are really good measures of ecosystem health. Can it bounce back after a moderate disturbance? Is it able to return and then after a more intense disturbance that would lead to secondary succession, can it return to where it was previously? So how can these ecosystems return? Well, ecosystems health are maintained often by keystone species. So you want to see these keystone species because they have a disproportionately large effect on the ecosystem, and the ecosystem generally without them will collapse. So there's maybe not a lot of them in number, but they have a really big impact on the ecosystem and the organisms that can survive there. So we're going to talk about 3 different types of keystone species: keystone predators, keystone engineers, and keystone mutualists. So I think my favorite one is probably the keystone predator, so we're going to start there. And this is an organism that eats other organisms. It's a predator, and by eating that other organism, it prevents it from eliminating another dominant species. So otters eat sea urchins. They are a keystone predator because they eat the sea urchins. The sea urchins eat the steadfasts of kelp beds. And so when they eat those steadfasts, the kelps detach from the bottom, and they end up dying, and you have the kelp forest disappear, and all of the organisms that lived in a kelp forest, which they're a lot like mangroves, where they're high habitat for hatcheries and different fish species and different types of algae or whatever that are living in the kelp forest. When you don't have the kelp forest anymore, you have a collapse of that entire kelp forest ecosystem. So sea urchins eat the kelp forest. And some of them, having some sea urchins is fine. They're not able to completely decimate the kelp forest, but having too many completely decimate the kelp forest. So what sea otters do is they predate on these sea urchins, and they're able to maintain a healthy kelp ecosystem. So that's what's called a keystone predator. There doesn't need to be a lot of sea otters in order to keep that sea urchin population under control enough to keep the kelp ecosystem healthy. But absence of the sea urchin means that you're going to have a collapse of the kelp forest. Another type of keystone species is a keystone engineer, an ecosystem engineer. And what these guys do is they change their environment fundamentally, and they end up providing habitats that wouldn't exist if they weren't there to make them. So think about alligator holes, and I think we talked about this in class. Alligators create alligator holes during the winter. They make these big, deep holes, which keeps water. And in the winter, in Florida, it's pretty dry, and so all the water dries up. But the alligator holes keep water year-round so that fish are able to survive, meaning that birds are able to survive as well. So without alligators, you don't have the alligator holes, and then all the fish and the whole ecosystem ends up collapsing. So that's not what you want to see there. My video stopped. Beavers are also keystone engineers, and they build dams and provide habitat for fish. So what beavers do is they create a dam in the river, which increases the amount of water storage for that river and water storage underneath. So it increases the size of that water table. Recent studies have shown that beaver extinction in the U.S. is actually what led to the desertification of the U.S. Southwest, and that before, when beavers were hunted to close to extinction for their pelt during early American history, and in places where there still are beavers, you have a lot of wetlands, and areas where the beavers were completely eliminated, you have desertification and the collapse of that ecosystem because of their ability to increase water. Keystone mutualists, which are 2 or more species that interact in a mutually beneficial way. A change in one species would impact the entire ecosystem. So it doesn't matter which one is interacted, they're like working together because they're mutualists, which was a type of community interaction that we talked about earlier this unit. So a really great example of a keystone mutualist are hummingbirds and the plants that they pollinate. So hummingbirds, if you've seen them before, they move super fast. They have really high metabolic rates. They need a lot of nectar a day. So what ends up happening is they pollinate like crazy. They're able to pollinate a really large area per day. They pollinate dozens of flowers daily. They feed 5 to 8 times per day. So they're able to really maintain gene flow, increase dispersal of different plants, and they need a lot of plants present. So absence of that nectar will impact the hummingbirds. They won't be able to pollinate, and then absence of the hummingbirds means that the whole plant community will collapse. So both of them are required to maintain this ecosystem.